It's Tetris, except not, on Virtual Boy Works Episode 13. If you can believe it, we're already at the final American release for Virtual Boy. It's been a wild, few months, huh? But no, Nintendo quickly cottoned to the fact that Virtual Boy fizzled immediately upon impact. Rather than attempting to rehabilitate and revitalize the platform the way they would its spiritual successor 3DS a decade and a half later, the company simply pulled the plug. Virtual Boy got its own price cut after half a year, but this was a far more drastic cut than 3DS's, and there were no ambassador games handed out to early Virtual Boy adopters. By spring of 1996, the system was essentially moribund around the world. Nintendo ended official support for the console in America and Japan. Retailers slashed prices, and any intent the company may have had to launch in Europe faded silently into the night. Peripherals like the VB Link cable and a number of in-development games were canned, including promising first-party titles like Zero Racers, Bound High, and Dragon Hopper. One final game made its way to market in the US toward the end of March 1996, 3D Tetris. The Japanese Virtual Boy had seen Tetris at launch, so it might seem surprising that it took so long for that release to make its way west. But the real kicker here is that this Tetris is a completely different take on the block-dropping classic than Japan's V Tetris, which we'll look at next episode. Where V Tetris was produced by Locomotive Corp and Bulletproof Software, 3D Tetris was another joint from our friends at T&E Soft. Also of note is the fact that this isn't really a Tetris game. Despite the name, 3D Tetris has very little to do with Alexei Pajitnov's block-dropping masterpiece. Oh, this game has you dropping blocks all right, but it observes none of the other iconic rules of Tetris, not least of which is the need for all blocks to consist of 4 squares in 7 different arrangements. No, 3D Tetris is a complete and total lift of a three-dimensional Tetris clone from 1987 called Blockout. You wouldn't know it to go by the game, though. The copyright indicia in 3D Tetris makes no mention of Blockout or its original rights holders, Logical Design Works or California Dreams. It's a weird case of erasure, with only the Tetris credit to Elorg and Pajitnov appearing at launch. But there's no question that this has more to do with Blockout than Tetris, a fact that might have been lost on gamers so locked into the Nintendo ecosystem that they actually bought a Virtual Boy. But it's something that would have been readily apparent to anyone who kept up with competing console lines. Blockout had made its way to the US on both Atari Lynx and Sega Genesis back in 1991. Sure, 3D Tetris adds a few new elements to that game, but the fundamental similarities are right there, bold as daylight. Naming semantics of this release aside, Blockout does make a lot of sense as a candidate for Virtual Boy conversion. Its entire premise was to give players a sort of top-down view into the Tetris well, with blocks falling into the screen toward the stack in the distance. This connects beautifully with Virtual Boy's parallax graphical effects, which are at their most effective when dealing with visuals that contrast the spatial positions of near and far objects. You get a much better sense here of the depth and relations of the falling objects in 3D Tetris than you could in standard Blockout games. 3D Tetris expands on the basic tenets of both Tetris and Blockout by including pieces never seen in the former in gameplay modes not present in the latter. Besides the standard Tetris-style clear a full line format, 3D Tetris includes a couple of puzzle-oriented modes as well. The standard Tetris mode is about what you'd expect. Blocks drop into the well and you need to completely fill a line, which is actually a layer since each quote-unquote line consists of a 5x5 grid, in order to clear away blocks. Unlike in true Tetris, where the well is much taller than it is wide, the space you're working with here is a cube. There are 5 levels of 5x5 block layers, and if a piece breaks beyond the kill line on the front of the cube, you're penalized by having one of the layers erased. The game becomes rapidly more difficult as layers vanish, as it leaves you less room to maneuver. Once you run out of layers altogether, the game ends. The standard 3D Tetris comes in 2 variants, similar in spirit to the A and B modes we saw in Game Boy Tetris. There's the usual endless mode in which you try to earn the highest score possible, as well as a mode called Clear It, in which you simply need to clear away 5 layers to win. The game becomes more unconventional once you shift away from the basic 3D Tetris mode. First, there's a puzzle mode that challenges you to create 3-dimensional shapes using a predefined set of blocks. Because this mode observes standard block gravity, you need to think not only of how to build the shapes, but also how to support their raised structures. Blocks won't simply stick in place once they reach a target space. They need physical bridge-style supports in order to span a gap. It's a challenging design that requires considerable planning and strong three-dimensional visualization skills. The difficulty ramps up pretty quickly, and there's no skipping ahead if you get stuck, though the game does have a battery-powered auto backup, so your hard-earned progress carries over from one session to the next. Finally, there's something called the center fill game, which is similar to standard 3D Tetris in that you're trying to clear layers of blocks. Unlike in the other mode though, the center block of each layer is a dead zone that causes any block placed there to vanish if you haven't met the proper conditions. The goal of center fill is to create symmetrical arrangements of blocks before placing a piece in the center. If your layer is tidy and even, dropping the center brick will cause that layer to clear away. The more spaces you have occupied on a layer when it's wiped, the more points you'll earn. It makes for a decent enough 3D interpretation of the falling block concept, but 3D Tetris isn't quite the home run it ought to be. T&E made some frustrating design choices here that diminish the overall experience. For one thing, they appear to have built this game on the same visual engine they used for Red Alarm. Everything appears here as wireframes, which is a reasonable enough choice on the technical front, I suppose. I don't think the Virtual Boy really had the horsepower necessary to fill the screen with solid polygons, so the wireframe approach allows 3D Tetris to drop blocks and have them rotate smoothly on all three axes. But even on Virtual Boy hardware, which is to say with parallax effects that don't come through in the single lens capture setup I use for these videos, 3D Tetris is visually challenging to deal with. Part of the problem is that the blocks are more complex than those of Tetris. They can bend and protrude on all three axes, and when you start sending jagged 3D wireframe boxes into a well of outlines, the headaches add up fast. The thing about Tetris is that you really need to be able to take in the entire active block well at a glance, and that's nearly impossible in 3D Tetris. The busy line work turns the well into a mess once pieces begin to stack. To combat this, T&E Soft uses the right margin of the screen to give you 5 layer-by-layer slices of the well to better indicate where gaps and blocks are located. But once the speed of the action ramps up, there's no realistic way to be able to shift your glance back and forth between the active well and the layer diagrams, especially since the diagrams don't incorporate parallax effects, which means your eyes are being forced to adjust from mono to stereo vision and back every time you shift focus from left to right. It's legitimately painful. Blockout never had this issue because it uses filled shapes with different colors, which makes it much easier to get a sense of the physical arrangement of the well at an instant glance. Obviously, differently colored blocks aren't possible on Virtual Boy, but the choice to go with vector-style lines rather than solids makes 3D Tetris both a difficult game and a difficult game to play for more than a few minutes at a time. T&E attempts to compensate for the busyness of the visuals by causing the well to constantly pivot. The rolling motion you see here is not optional. You can manually shift the well clockwise or counterclockwise by fixed increments, but so far as I can tell, there's no way to stop it from moving in general. This honestly causes more problems than it solves because the constant movement is incredibly distracting. Rather than allowing you to get a visual fix on the well and concentrate, you're forced to keep track of its motion, or manually nudge the well back into its optimal position. This is a massive pain when you're trying to concentrate on a particular area, and the rotation keeps causing that section of the well to move to the back of the screen. Yes, you can tap a button to reverse or advance the well's motion, but that seems like a lot to ask of the player when they're already trying to manage blocks in 3D and rotate pieces on 3 axes, all while being mindful of the dynamic cross-section diagrams in the rightmost margin. Another weird design choice, the blocks here have all been anthropomorphized, so the next piece display features a constant stream of weird, milk and cheese looking renditions of the blocks. I guess the idea was that putting wigs and angry eyebrows on the blocks would make it easier for players to see at a glance what's coming down the pipeline without the need to try and visually parse some very complex and abstract shapes on the fly, but yeah, I don't know about this one. All in all, 3D Tetris is more of a miss than a success. I feel like T&E was really trying their best on this one, but they had to fight against the fundamental limitations of a system designed for 3D gaming, yet not quite equipped to make 3D gaming work. And so, in that sense, I suppose you could say that 3D Tetris is a perfect capstone for the system's run in America. It's a noble attempt, but it just had too much working against it. Just like the Virtual Boy. Next episode, we hop over to explore the Japan exclusive side of Virtual Boy with actual Tetris.